Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday, January 10th. Well, late last week we started talking about a stratospheric warming event that could ultimately change the weather pattern here in the Mid-Atlantic region and much of the east and central part of the U.S. back to cold after this current mild spell ends. We have a mild weather pattern continuing right into the early part of next week. In fact, it'll peak this weekend with very unseasonably mild weather throughout the I-95 corridor on Saturday and Sunday. But the stratospheric warming event that we talked about last week is definitely having an impact on global weather patterns, and we'll talk about that over the next few minutes. It looks like much colder weather will move back into the eastern states by the middle and latter part of next week. Well, we showed this 30-day loop a couple of different times earlier in the week, and this is a real good way of seeing exactly the explosion in temperatures at the upper part of the atmosphere that occurred near the end of December into the first week of January. And here this red blob indicates the stratospheric warming. This is a temperature anomaly over the last 30 days at 10 millibars, which is the highest part of the atmosphere, way up in the stratosphere. And here we are 30 degrees north, 60 degrees north, and 90 degrees north. We're at the polar region. And notice here, towards the end of December, this warming started occurring over Asia, and then it just kind of exploded northward up into the higher latitudes, and now it's kind of spread across the entire polar region, and that will have an impact on actual global weather conditions over the next few weeks. Well, one of the first things we notice with this particular stratospheric warming event is the changes here seen in this 10 millibar temperature pattern from the North Pole. The North Pole is situated right in this circular region right here. And normally there is a polar vortex shown here by the cold temperatures, the blue conditions. Normally there's a polar vortex sitting right near or at the North Pole region, and that has split into two. It has weakened and split into two with this stratospheric warming event. Warmer air now is in the upper part of the atmosphere, sitting right near and over the North Pole, and the normal single entity polar vortex has weakened and split into two parts, one over here and one over here. Here's the U.S. right in this region right here. Now, many times in the past, stratospheric warming events will have an impact on temperatures maybe 10, 15, 20 days later. What typically happens is the stratosphere warms up, it kind of expands and suppresses the troposphere, cools the troposphere first at the northern latitudes, and then that translates into a displacement of the colder air situated near the polar regions down into mid-latitudes. Sometimes that colder air can move on the other side of the pole in towards Asia and Europe, for example, and not onto the U.S.-Canadian side of the pole. In fact, last winter we had quite a warm winter here in the U.S., but there was a stratospheric warming event that actually led to some very cold weather in Europe and Asia last winter, as the displacement of the cold air sent the cold air down on the other side of the pole. But there certainly are indications here that we will get colder here in the eastern part of the U.S. later this week into the next weekend. How long that lasts is still up in the air right now, but certainly a change in the weather pattern. By the way, cold air will spill down on the other side of the pole. Europe and Asia look to be in for some extreme cold weather over the next couple of weeks. Here's just one other way to look and see how dramatic this stratospheric warming event has been. This red line here represents the change in temperatures in just a short amount of time. This is a monthly chart here, November, December, and January. In just a short amount of time, the temperature just skyrocketed here at 10 millibars. Again, this is in the northern latitudes. We're looking at the composite here from the pole down to 65 degrees north. The northern latitudes at 10 millibars, the stratospheric temperatures just jumped. Actually, compared to last winter, it's much more dramatic. See what happened here compared to last winter at this time. This is quite an impressive stratospheric warming event here, and we'll see over the next 10, 15, 20 days exactly what kind of impact it has, but it certainly looks like it'll lead to displacement of the cold air that's normally bottled up near the polar regions down into the mid-latitudes. Well, the stratospheric warming event actually sets off a series of events, a chain of events that one of the things that typically results from a stratospheric warming event is blocking will set up over Greenland or somewhere near Greenland, and that blocking in the atmosphere helps to displace colder air into the central and eastern part of the U.S. And one of the ways to track if blocking is actually setting up in the atmosphere is through a couple of indices called the Arctic Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation. And we mentioned last week at the beginning of the stratospheric warming event that we'll monitor these to see if they in fact turn from positive to negative, because negative is indicative of blocking setting up over the northern latitudes in and around the Greenland area. And sure enough, here's last night's GFS ensemble run for the Arctic Oscillation. Still a little bit of positive right about now, but this trend, no doubt, is very clear here. It looks like it's going negative. This is indicative of that blocking pattern setting up as a result, or at least partially as a result of the stratospheric warming event here, the Arctic Oscillation going negative. Now how about the NAO? Well, the same sort of pattern here with the North Atlantic Oscillation. This is from last night's European ensemble run. Again, slightly positive in the current time frame, but generally a trend negative over the next 5, 10, 15 days or so. These plots are from RaleighWeather.com. So one of the first signs we were looking at to see what kind of impact, if any, the stratospheric warming event would have is followed by these NAO, AO indices, and indeed they look like they're going negative, which is indicative of blocking setting up over the northern latitudes. Well, a couple other charts to show what exactly could happen here over the next 5, 10 days or so as a result of the stratospheric warming event. And again, that's not the only factor here. We talked about widespread snowpack throughout the northern hemisphere. That certainly contributes to the redevelopment of some cold air up to our north here, and the source regions for cold air here in the Mid-Atlantic region, namely Canada, Alaska, and even across the pole in Asia. This is the European model from last night, the 500 millibar height pattern in the 7 to 10 day time frame. Late next week and next weekend, the weekend of the 19th and 20th, for example. This is the forecast from the European model run. Several things to point out here, indicative of a cold air, a blocking pattern setting up, and cold air moving at least into the northeastern part of the U.S. First of all, quite a ridge developing here along the west coast. We haven't really seen this kind of a pattern that much this year. The European model, it has quite a bit of ridging here, and that helps in turn to send cold air down into the central part of the U.S. Second of all, we have this blocking pattern here indicated here by the yellow, the oranges and reds here over places like Greenland and over the poles. So here's the colder air situated right here over southeastern Canada, south central Canada, and the northeastern part of the U.S. And this kind of a pattern here is a blocking pattern. This is with the NAO and AO going negative indicates that this tends to block the cold air down in this region here, which can certainly in turn cool off the northeastern part of the U.S. Another factor we've had for much of the winter and last winter as well, by the way, was a ridge in the southeastern part of the U.S. that has kind of helped to keep us warmer than normal last winter and this winter. Not too atypical in a La Nina type of Pacific Ocean temperature pattern. But notice here it's flattened. Everything kind of gets flattened here. That southeastern U.S. ridge is flattened and maybe weakens and moves out over the ocean with this particular pattern. So lots of things going on here. We also mentioned the European and Asian side of the pole and the fact that they could get very cold over the next couple of weeks. And indeed, here's what the European model is showing here. This is on the other side of the pole. So very cold air here over Europe, Asia, and the southeastern part of Canada into the Midwest and northeastern part of the U.S. late next week and weekend, and we'll see if it lasts for much beyond that period. Now, it's a little too early to call on that. Well, one final map to show what could lie ahead here. This is a 10-day forecast from last night's European model run for the temperature pattern here in the lowest part of the atmosphere, the 850 millibar pattern. And this is just extremely cold air here over the extreme northern part of the U.S., New England, and the south central and southeastern part of Canada. Basically, the coldest air in all of North America has dropped down into this, from the pole into this part of the world. And this is, again, a forecast for 10 days out. So we'll continue to monitor this. A major stratospheric warming event has occurred. It has weakened and split the polar vortex, the stratospheric polar vortex, and in turn that'll displace some very cold air down into the lower latitudes over the next week to 10 days, all the way out a couple of weeks perhaps. And we'll monitor all of this at the SIweather.com. That's it for now. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.